everyone. It's Megan Ramos, and I'm here with my wonderful co-host, Dr. Nadia Pataguana. Nadia, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Megan. How are you?
I'm doing well. We've got some great Q&A questions for this week's episode from our listeners. I'm really excited to jump on in.
I love these. These are the fun episodes because we get to answer all your questions. And of course, you'll get both mine and Megan's input, which are always very consistent, although we have our own personality and way of saying things, which is quite fun, in my opinion.
I think we add to each other's answers. We both have so much experience. So really enjoy doing this because we get to kind of merge and fuse both of our knowledge from all of our years fasting people. One of the things I love about these episodes is that we get to dispel a whole bunch of garbage information about fasting that we see out there, especially on social media, or even the other day at the supermarket. I was at our local Sprouts and there was this, guide to intermittent fasting magazine. And I opened it up because I was like, this is cool, right? When at the grocery store do you see a magazine about fasting? But the information, oh my goodness. So we get to set the record straight, which is what I love about these episodes the most.
And I always say that, really encourage you guys to keep sending in your questions. I know sometimes people think, well, this is such a repetitive question, or you've heard it before. I think repetition is key, especially because our answers, as I said, luckily tend to be very, very consistent. And I think that the more that you hear something, the more it will become apparent that some of these myths that you're hearing out there are just coming from people who have zero experience with fasting. They've never fasted someone, or maybe they're basing on one situation that, for whatever reason, unrelated probably. So it's really important to hear it from the people who have had the clinical experience and have fasted thousands of people, and so repetition is important. I think, ask me the same question 100,000 times. I want to repeat it 100,000 times if that's what it takes.
All right. Well, let's jump in. We've got some great questions. So Nadia, you're up to bat first here. The question is, why can't I put milk in my tea while I'm fasting?
That's awesome. Do you know, Megan, that I just answered this question not so long ago in a live stream? And again, I am often known as the dairy sort of dictator, which is not true. I have nothing. First of all, I want to make this very, very clear because I have written about dairy. So have you. So has Dr. Fung. And, sometimes when people read through, they come out with this idea that dairy, that we're saying dairy is good or bad. First of all, I don't like to categorize foods as good or bad. Okay. I also don't like to categorize foods as too high in carbs or too low in carbs, or whether it's too high in calories or too low in calories. It really is about the insulin for me, right? So I think at some point, again, this is going to become quite repetitive, and I'm glad that it does. It's really about the insulin response. So unfortunately, what we write about dairy, like every other food, is that all foods have an insulin response. And some foods have a very, very high insulin response. And some foods have lower, and some, and very, very few foods have an insignificant insulin response, right? And so for that reason, dairy is not a great fasting aid, right? We've talked about this a million times. So when we're talking about putting milk in your tea, I think we're talking about a fasting aid, right? This is something that you're having during your fasting period, whether it's in between your meals for an eating day or if it's during a full day fast. The person that asked me this question in my live stream, the question was, does it break a fast? How many times a day can I put milk in my tea? And how much milk can I put in my tea? Well, my answer is, I don't think milk is a reasonable, appropriate fasting aid, because milk, like most other forms of dairy, and particularly milk even more so, will have a very high and significant insulin response. And that's not what you want when you're fasting. When you're fasting, you want to lower that insulin all the way down to a very low insulin, fat burning, weight loss mode, high energy, high ketone mode, however you want to define it. But what you want to do between meals and during your fasting periods is you want to lower insulin. You don't want to raise insulin at all, and much less significantly. And unfortunately, dairy, not because it's a bad food, So what I'm saying is, I think dairy is perfectly appropriate for most of us, or many of us at least, during our meals. But I don't think that milk is an appropriate fasting aid for that reason. It will raise your insulin. So if insulin goes up, you go into fat storage mode, right? You don't go into fat burning mode. And that's not what you want when you are fasting. The only reason why you're fasting, most of us anyway, most of you guys, is to go into fat burning mode. So don't put milk in your tea. Instead, you can find some more appropriate fasting aids. And we've talked about that quite a bit, and we'll talk about it again. What do you think, Megan?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can totally snack on your fasting days with these fasting aids. And when it comes to milk in particular, people need to realize that in naturally occurring foods, there's a trade-off between sugar and fat. And milk tends to be lower in fat. So if it's lower in fat, it's just naturally going to be higher in sugar too. So this is why other aids, like having some coconut oil or having some butter, again, there's a trade-off, right? They're really high in fat and they don't have sugar in them. So there's this natural trade-off when it comes to these types of fasting training meals too. So it's so important that we don't snack, we don't graze on them for hours, which can be really easy to do on our fasting days. We need to sit down, enjoy our beverages, but keep in mind about these fasting aids, even though they're natural things like milk, if it's the milk tends to be pretty low fat. So there's going to be a trade-off there with sugar, absolutely. And that's going to have more and more of an insulin response.
Absolutely. And dairy in and of itself has another component. So besides the fat and the sugar trade-off, it has another component that in and of itself, the type of protein that's in dairy and milk, in and of itself has an insulin response. So we do often focus, it's pretty simple usually. We focus on, fat and the sugar trade-off. But when it comes to certain foods like dairy, there's another component, one that on its own particularly raises insulin significantly in people that are more insulin resistant. So again, not to say you can't have dairy, you just have to be aware of it. Bring it into your meals always. That's my opinion there. And I think that at some point in your initial journey, if you're very, very insulin resistant, you have to keep it down to a much lower amount. And when you're much less insulin resistant, then you could probably have a bit more dairy.
Yeah, we should really do a whole hot topic episode on dairy because, like conventional dairy, the cows are often pregnant while they're still producing milk, and then there ends up with all kinds of estrogen. And there's another protein in dairy called casein. There's different types of this protein, and some versions of it are really inflammatory, and it just often sets people back too. I personally don't really eat that much dairy. We use the odd bit of butter as cooking. I really try to cycle through my cooking fats. So duck fat, beef tallow, we use lard, and then of course like olive oil, coconut oil, we use some avocado oil. So we cycle the butter in because I'm a big believer in getting a variety of fats. But we don't really eat dairy. But I think it's so hard because many people, when they transition, and many people who are fasting, and we're actually going to get to this question in an upcoming episode, but many people who are fasting are doing some lower carb version diet. Now, you don't need to, and stay tuned because we're going to chat about that soon. So you don't need to, but many people are. And it's a big transformation to go from eating the standard North American diet to a lower carb diet. So like so many of you, I went through this too, where trying to find substitutes for familiar foods as you learn to navigate a new eating style. And a lot of those foods are really heavy in dairy. And so for someone who doesn't really eat dairy, I struggled during that initial period of time where I was trying to look for substitutes for things that I liked. And maybe it was a bit of a blessing in disguise that I don't really like dairy because it forced me to say, okay, you need to really eat ancestral, eat primitive. Your meals have got to change. You just can't make replicas for everything that you used to eat. And now the way of my eating is very different. So it was a shorter learning curve, I think, without the dairy, but there's so many great foods out there that are dairy free. But anyways, we'll do a hot topic episode on that before we end up making this a hot topic episode on dairy.
That's true.
All right. The next question is, I know Dr. Fung says no to sweeteners, but how about monk fruit? Is there another way to sweeten my tea or make desserts? So it's important to know that we are not really agnostic about a lot of nutritional items. For example, we recently had a holiday in Canada, and I'm not in Canada, I'm in the US. But we were having friends over for that holiday, and they don't eat like I do or my husband does. So I bought them healthier versions of certain foods that are traditional around this holiday time. And they just had slightly better quality ingredients. So no wheat flour, no, sort of refined and processed table sugar. And they had something like monk fruit in them. And this is not something I did grab, one little of these cookies myself, but stayed away from it. But there are these times throughout the year that you can definitely include sweeteners into your baking, or just because maybe you do want a bit of a sweetened iced tea one day. You just don't want to make this your routine. You don't want to be drinking sweetened tea every day. With every dinner, you don't want to be having those desserts that are artificially sweetened. So for special occasions, heck yes, you can absolutely have them. And I know Jason feels this way. And this is exactly what we used to tell the patients in the clinic. This is exactly what we tell people over at our fasting method community and in our coaching program. So it's not, no, never, but it's for those special times. And I feel there's so much online where people get stuck in these camps. One of my poor cousins, a couple Thanksgivings ago, she was brand new to the low carb lifestyle. And she knew that I just genuinely didn't eat these substitution foods. And she said, it's going to be really difficult for me to show up at your mother's house if I don't make a substitution for pumpkin pie, because I'm going to end up eating the pumpkin pie that her aunt or my mom has. And I said, Sarah, make the keto pumpkin pie. Like there's a time and a place, but every weekend, don't eat a keto pumpkin pie. So that's what you need to be aware of in general. Now, when people are going to be having these special treats on occasion, I am a bigger fan of monk fruit. And I am a bigger fan of actually pure maple syrup. So one thing, my husband is a breakfast person, and we're not talking bacon and eggs. Of course, he loves that. But I'm talking about the breakfast he grew up having in Central Florida. So not the greatest foods. So a couple times a year when it's his birthday or a special occasion for him, we'll make those pancakes, those almond flour pancakes or coconut flour pancakes or waffles. And we'll take some butter and we'll add in just a few drops of pure maple syrup, and we'll make a maple flavored butter and put that on top of the coconut flour pancakes or waffles. So dosage makes the poison too with this stuff as well. So you are in control of the dosage, and you can mix it into other things like butter just to add that hint of sweetness. So pure maple syrup, monk fruit, definitely my favorite go-tos. Now for other natural sweeteners like stevia or sugar alcohols, we've seen some issues with people trying to use these on a more consistent basis. And usually when they come into our program, they're actively checking their blood sugar levels. They're going for regular blood work. And these individuals all find that they're struggling with their fasting. They don't understand why they can't fast like their peers. They're always hungry, and they always have some degree of IBS, whether it's just cramping and discomfort or just spending too much time in the bathroom. And, we understand that people are making big changes, and it takes a while to adapt to these lifestyle changes when you start fasting and cutting out some of the processed foods in your diet. So I try to be a little bit more understanding, but let people know that these are things that we're going to probably want to cut out in the future. And usually people just get sick and tired of feeling sick and tired when their peers are doing so well. And we'll make the cut. We'll cut out the stevia, and we'll cut out the xylitol, erythritol, and suddenly their tummy's better. There's no more IBS-like symptoms. Their appetite's down. They're fasting more. And when we did have the in-person clinic, I would actually check insulin levels quite regularly in our patient population. And those who had these quote unquote natural sweeteners, they always struggled the most to bring down their insulin levels. So, not always was there a glucose response, but we were definitely seeing their insulin being roadblocked by this. And again, as soon as we cut it out, they start to see that insulin drop like their peers. So, I know it's quite controversial. And if you can do well on it and you like it, sure, keep it in your routine. But if you're not hitting your milestone goals the way that you want and you are struggling, it might be something you want to take a look at removing from your diet and then just having on these special occasions. Nadia, I know this is something that we see every day at the Fasting Method. Do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I definitely think that you've touched upon all of the important points. And then at the risk of sounding repetitive, and of course, on purpose, as I said, I'm a fan of repetition. I think that, you got to really look at these things for what they are. Like you said, often, and I want to be very direct about this. Very often we have diabetics tell us, that sweetener doesn't raise my blood sugars because they either have a CGM or they check repetitively. You may not see it at that moment, right? It doesn't raise your blood sugar maybe, but like you said, it definitely raises your insulin. And how do we know? We know because we test their insulin levels in clinic often, or at least we used to. And also, if you want to test it yourself, what you can do is, okay, it doesn't raise my blood sugar right now, but what's my blood sugar tomorrow morning, right? Which is a really great reflection of insulin resistance. So every time that I've had people take the challenge and remove the sweeteners on a daily basis and compare their morning blood sugars from one week to the next, there's usually a very significant and obvious drop. So if you want to test it out yourself, please do. And so again, if you want to take this in a more of a step-by-step or just a summary of everything that we're saying that we're not, again, even categorizing these as good or bad. That's not the point. It's how often you want to have this, definitely not between meals. Okay. Not a fasting aid. You don't want to put sweeteners in your tea or coffee between meals because you don't want to be raising insulin between meals. We talked about that when we talked about dairy. Do you want to bring it into every single one of your meals? Probably not. I can speak from experience. When I started doing low carb, of course, I wanted to try all the substitutes, and I did. And what I found was that I had a really hard time fasting between meals, right? I was grazing and snacking because it raises your insulin and you just want to keep eating. So again, even your fasting periods between meals are going to be hard if you're having sweeteners at every meal. Okay. But like Megan said, and even the not so great sweeteners, I'm not a huge drinker. I don't drink a ton of alcohol. So I'll admit to having, I shouldn't, but I admit to having a Coke Zero every once in a while when we go out because, while everybody else is drinking something, I sometimes will drink that too. But if I were to have Coke Zero on a daily basis, I would not be sitting here talking with Megan today because I would be just down that rabbit hole, slippery slope. My diabetes would come back. I mean, my insulin levels would go up. It's not something I could have or would want to have. Of course, it's not a real food like Megan was talking about. But the reality is that these things, whether they're good or bad, raise your insulin. I don't think that you're going to have great success having it on a daily basis. I definitely don't think you can have them between meals, but on occasion, for sure, if it works for you, especially if you can recover from it, especially.
All right, Nadia, this question is one of my veins of my existence, but I think it's important to address. It is, do I have to check my ketones?
I actually don't mind this question at all, Megan, and I'll tell you why.
Really?
Yes, I don't mind it at all. I think that I definitely don't think you have to check ketones, but I'll tell you why I don't mind this question at all. A few years ago, I had never checked my ketones, but I was already doing low carb and intermittent fasting, and people talked about ketones a ton. Urine strips and blood ketones and breath ketones. And then you and I went to a conference and you offered us all a Keto Mojo. I don't even know if you remember this. And so now I had a Keto Mojo and a new device, a fun device. And so then I decided that, and keep in mind that I was already a clinician advising on low carb diets and intermittent fasting. I already knew a ton about ketones and insulin and how the relationship between the two. And I could explain it really well. But I had never checked my ketones. I never needed to. because I was able to reverse all of my concerns and get off of medication without ever checking ketones. So do I think you need to check ketones? Absolutely not. But if you do check ketones, if you want to check ketones, if you like numbers, if you like fun machines, you can, and you can often confirm a lot of the things that we're talking about. So you can do it if you want. And if you don't want to, you don't need to, because if something is working, you will know. And if it's not working, you will also know, right? So there are many other ways to check if you're healing. And so when you ask me, well, how do I know I'm better? Well, what were your concerns to begin with? If it's higher blood sugars, you should see a significant drop in blood sugar, especially in the morning, over time. If you're not seeing that, then it's time to readjust your plan. Get some help in the community or through one of us. All checking ketones is going to do is confirm what we're already saying. So again, what's going to happen to your ketones if you have too much dairy? What's going to happen to your ketones if you have sweeteners between meals? What's going to happen to your ketones if you graze and snack on your eating days? So I think it's just a confirmation if you want that confirmation. So no, I don't think you have to check ketones, but if you learn how to, there are blood meters, there are breath meters, there are urine strips are only really useful at the very, very beginning of your journey. If you're just wanting to look at whether or not you're going into ketosis, it won't give you levels and not something you can rely on over time. So what I did a few years ago, it's quite a few years ago, looking back now, I think it was 2018, is I decided to do a diary, and I called it my keto measuring journey. And I've put this up in my Instagram. I've put a link to an old blog that I wrote for our community back in 2018. And so it was a fun experiment. It was a journal. Basically, I checked my ketones and blood sugars about 6 times a day for like weeks on end. And I took pictures of everything that I ate and what time I ate. And I made correlations. And all it did was confirm what I already knew. I didn't learn anything new. I've looked back and looked at that journal or diary. It didn't tell me anything I didn't already know, but it confirmed a whole lot of stuff. So it was fun, and I'm glad I did it. But do I check ketones often? I don't. I don't need to. I pretty much know what works and what doesn't work for me. How about you, Megan?
Yeah, I guess I need to justify why I said this question is the bane of my existence. I want to put this out there and set the record straight for people who are scared about getting overwhelmed with data points, because I hear you. I hear you, former Weight Watchers, point trackers, or former calorie counters. I am a scientist and I geek out on data, but everything I had done in my life up to trying to reverse my diabetic issues and lose this weight when my metabolic health was so garbage, I did deep dives into data, and I went really hardcore with everything, in my whole life. Finances, relationships, friendships. I had data on everything. That's just how I function. And you get stuck in this bit of a perfectionist mentality. And there's different factors that can affect the data. So I threw my hands up in the air and I said, I am, for the first time in my life, going to listen to my body and how I feel. I'm not going to look at the scale. I'm going to see how my pants are fitting, and I will check my blood work. And I reversed my diabetic issues, PCOS, fatty liver, lost the weight without ever once checking my ketones. Have I checked my ketones since? Absolutely. I have a Biosense breathalyzer. I have the blood monitor too, the Keto Mojo. And I love this data now that I'm in this healthy stage, but I hit all of my markers. So you don't need to do it. But now I'm really into the data. I really geek out on the data, and I like biohacking and using myself as N=1 and confirming things that I might know, kind of like what Nadia is talking about. But there are things that can affect one's ability to produce ketones. So thyroid disorders, inadequate thyroid medication, changes as we get older, especially ladies with our hormones, can sort of affect our ketone output. So where I get bogged down by it is when I feel like people are just chasing the ketones. And due to factors outside of their control, they just can't get them or get enough of them. And it doesn't mean that they're not healing their insulin resistance and they're not able to lose body fat, they're not improving metabolic syndrome. You still can do all of those things without chasing these ketones. And I see it break so many people's hearts. And then they end up giving up on fasting or giving up on real food nutrition. So I think you can really, and I've recommended it too for certain circumstances, like Nadia's mentioning, when people need that confirmation of what they're doing is resulting in something therapeutic. And even there have been times I've recommended to a handful of individuals that I can't necessarily figure out what's going wrong with them. Why aren't we seeing the results? All right, I want you to check your ketone levels so I can get some empirical data about what's going on with you. But I know the whole picture with these clients too. So I think it's a sticky subject, but I am someone who has benefited from not checking them, and I'm someone who has benefited from checking them, but you need to just be aware of the fuller picture. So the ketones are just one data point that can help you. And where I get into frustration with them is when people say it's like they become convinced it's the only data point that means anything. It's not. It helps give you one piece of the puzzle. So you need to pay attention to how you're feeling, your waist circumference, how your clothes are fitting. Those things combined with ketones and glucose and other lab biometrics or other lab biomarkers, that will give you the whole picture for how well you're progressing. So don't make ketones your whole story is my long-winded answer for that summary point.
That makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense to me.
And on to another question. So, do I have to count carbohydrates? And the answer is no. So, fasting is diet agnostic. Are you going to optimize your health eating a lot of junk food and a lot of refined and processed sugars and fats? No, you're not. Can you lose weight? Can you improve your biomarkers? Absolutely. I mean, Jason and I had some patients in the clinic who just ate like garbage. I'm talking, imagine a 4-year-old kid given $200 to go into the grocery store without adult supervision and buy whatever they wanted. Can you imagine what that kid would have walked out of the grocery store with? We had patients who ate like that. And they were able to lose some of the weight. They were able to drop some of the medications. Were they able to fully optimize their health, hit all of their goals, and be these incredibly, biohacker, health optimization individuals? Absolutely not. But could they improve the quality of their health and their life? Still, yes, they can. And they did. But in general, you really want to focus on a real whole food approach, and you want to eat until you're satiated. So you want to get rid of processed and refined sugars, but you also want to get rid of processed and refined fats. Processed and refined fats are not sugar. They're not carb, but do you know what? They're just as inflammatory. They're just as insulinogenic, meaning they're going to cause your body to produce just as much insulin. So I actually cringe when I read things like, or see people eating like those roasted almonds and the like terribly refined and processed fat, and them thinking they're making such a good dietary choice versus the candy bar. And I see this all the time at the airport, and I just like want to rip out my hair because this fat is bad. And the almonds are good in terms of fat, but the fat that they're roasted in is bad. So we've got to show some anger, towards refined and processed fats too, just not the carbs. Now, when it comes to a real whole food diet, it's important that you eat until you're full. It's important to make sure that you are not struggling with satiation issues. So you're able to feel satiated, because if you're not, maybe you're not getting enough protein or enough dietary fat. If you're craving a lot of sugar all of the time, that's a big signal that you're not getting enough protein in the diet. And it's easy to fall short on the fat and the protein as well. So you've got to listen. You got to make sure you are feeling good and you are feeling full after your meals. But really, when it comes to the carbs, you want to have real whole food carbs. So you want to eat, some root vegetables people can tolerate, not everybody, or at certain points in their journey journey, they can't, but you will want to, if you're going to eat carbs, lots of leafy greens, lots of non-starchy vegetables that grow above the ground. Avocados, olives are great fruit with like next to no sugar in them. Their carbs are all fibrous. So eating these carbs, like Brussels sprouts, really didn't hurt anybody cooked, So these carbs you don't need to necessarily count meticulously. So when you eat until you feel full. And the big things are fast when you fast. Don't try to load your fasting days full of training meals. Fast when you fast. On your eating days, eat at your meals. Don't eat in between. Don't snack. And it will all work itself out. So you don't need to meticulously count carbs. And counting carbs was something that I gave up as part of throw all of the data outside the window while I was trying to lose weight. And I just listened to my body, and it really guided me. For individuals that must count carbs, I do give some rules. Don't count leafy greens. Don't count vegetables that grow above the ground. Don't count olives, and don't count avocados. Count carbs for everything else. So you make sure that you're not eating too many carbs that we can sometimes get into trouble with. So examples would be nuts and seeds, root vegetables, and other fruits aside from olives and avocados. Count those if you really must need to count, but don't worry about counting the rest. Nadia, what do you think?
It's so funny. I agree. I think if we're all eating a very, very traditional diet, we wouldn't have to count anything. We would just be getting enough of everything because our ancestors would have figured this one out for us. But because we're not eating a traditional diet whatsoever, sometimes we're a bit lost. So we want to count because we need to. But, it's much more about making sure you're getting the appropriate amount of protein and fat than it is about the carbs, right? Because protein and fat are essential, the healthy fats anyway, as you said. And so when it comes to carbs, I definitely don't think that you need to. I think that sometimes how you feel after a meal tells you whether you've had too much of certain things. If you're not feeling satiated, if you feel very grazy and craving, it's probably because you've had either too many carbs at that particular meal or just processed stuff in general will leave you feeling that way, right? Because these things, as you said, are insulinogenic as well. I often tell this story in our community. It's a super funny story. I think you remember this, Megan. When Jason and I wrote the PCOS plan, I was in charge of doing the recipe section of the book. And I thought I was doing a really great job by doing the nutritional facts for all of the recipes. And gosh, it took me hours and hours and days to do all the counts. And then when I sent it over to him to review, he's like, no. And he scrapped all of it out, deleted all of that hours and hours of work, because he also doesn't think that you need to carb count or macro count or whatever you want to call it. It's all about the insulin. And so I totally agree with you, Megan. It's all about full meals, walking away feeling satiated. And if you don't feel full and satiated, then adjust that meal.
Thanks, Nadia. And thank you to everybody who joined us for today's episode. If you have questions that you'd love for Nadia or myself to tackle during one of these episodes, please email them to podcast@thefastingmethod.com. Again, that's podcast@thefastingmethod.com. And to learn more about the fasting method and all of the work Nadia and myself and our entire team at TFM is up to, you can head over to thefastingmethod.com. All right, everyone, that's a wrap for today's episode. Happy fasting, my friends, and we'll see you again next week.
Bye, guys.